What if the moment a narcissistic person knows they're guilty is the exact moment they stop talking about what they did and start attacking you? Because sometimes the biggest clue that someone knows they crossed a line isn't their confession. It's the sudden explosion of defensiveness. And in this video, we're going to look at what can happen when accountability threatens someone's carefully protected self-image and why their reaction can tell you more than their words. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking, wait, how did I become the problem? You're not alone. Pause here and follow/subscribe, because understanding these patterns can help you stop getting pulled into endless arguments about your character and start paying attention to behavior. When a person knows they have done something wrong, we often expect guilt to lead to accountability. We expect them to stop, reflect, recognize the damage they caused, and say, I was wrong. But with someone who has strong narcissistic traits, guilt may trigger something very different. Instead of focusing on the harm they caused, they may become intensely focused on protecting their self-image. This is an important distinction. Accountability requires a person to tolerate the uncomfortable reality that they made a mistake. They have to sit with the fact that their behavior may have hurt someone, damaged trust, or revealed a part of themselves they don't want to acknowledge. For someone whose sense of self depends heavily on being right, superior, admirable, or blameless, that realization can feel threatening. So instead of moving toward responsibility, they may move into defense. They might deny what happened, minimize it, explain it away, blame someone else, or become angry that the issue was even raised. You may hear statements like, you're making this a bigger deal than it is, or I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't pushed me. Notice what is missing: genuine ownership. The conversation becomes less about the behavior and more about protecting their identity. And this can leave the other person incredibly confused because you're looking for resolution while they're looking for escape from discomfort. But remember, defensiveness alone does not mean someone is a narcissist. Everyone can become defensive when confronted. The key is the pattern. Does the person eventually reflect, acknowledge the harm, apologize without excuses, and change their behavior? Or do they repeatedly make accountability impossible? Because real accountability isn't about producing the perfect apology. It's about accepting responsibility and demonstrating change. You don't have to force someone to admit they are guilty. Sometimes their repeated refusal to take responsibility is information in itself. Watch what they do after they are confronted. Their behavior after the confrontation may tell you far more than their words during it. When a narcissistic person realizes that they have been caught doing something wrong, one of the first reactions you may encounter is denial. Instead of acknowledging what happened, they may immediately reject the reality of the situation. That didn't happen. I never said that. You're remembering it wrong. You're completely misunderstanding me. The speed and certainty of the denial can leave you wondering whether you somehow got the entire situation wrong. But denial isn't always about proving that something didn't happen. Sometimes it's about avoiding the emotional discomfort that comes with admitting it did. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, accepting wrongdoing can threaten the image they have created of themselves. They may need to see themselves as intelligent, good, powerful, justified, or superior. Admitting I hurt someone can collide with that image. So instead of confronting the behavior, they may reject the reality surrounding it. This can become particularly confusing when you have evidence. You may show messages, explain exactly what happened, or calmly describe what you witnessed, only to hear another denial. Then the conversation becomes an exhausting debate over facts that you thought were already established. This is where you need to stop asking yourself, how can I explain this better? Sometimes the problem isn't that you haven't explained it clearly enough. The other person may simply be unwilling to accept information that threatens their self-image. And remember, denial by itself does not prove narcissism. People deny things for many reasons, including fear, shame, embarrassment, or ordinary defensiveness. What matters is the larger pattern. Does the person eventually calm down, reconsider, and acknowledge what happened? Can they take responsibility when the evidence is clear? Can they repair the damage? Or does every confrontation lead to another version of reality? You don't have to win an argument with someone who refuses to acknowledge what happened. Your responsibility is not to force a confession. Your responsibility is to remain grounded in what you experienced. Pay attention to patterns and decide what boundaries you need based on the behavior you repeatedly see. When someone is confronted with behavior they know was wrong, one of the most revealing responses can be the sudden shift in responsibility. Instead of staying with the original issue, they turn the conversation toward what you supposedly did to cause it. You say, you lied to me, and suddenly the response becomes, I only lied because you were always questioning me. You say, you hurt me. And suddenly you're hearing, well, you made me angry. This is blame shifting. The focus moves away from the person's behavior and toward your behavior, your personality, your mistakes, or your reaction. And this can be incredibly confusing because there may actually be problems in the relationship. You may have made mistakes. You may have said something hurtful. You may have handled a situation badly, but those things don't automatically erase the original behavior. Two things can be true at the same time. You can acknowledge something you did wrong while still holding another person responsible for what they did. Blame shifting becomes especially damaging when it becomes a consistent strategy for avoiding accountability. Every conversation starts with their behavior and somehow ends with you apologizing for your existence. You came to discuss the lie, and now you're defending your tone. You came to discuss the betrayal, and now you're explaining your childhood. You came to discuss the disrespect, and now you're being told that you're the real problem. Notice the pattern. The original issue keeps disappearing. This doesn't mean every person who deflects responsibility is narcissistic. People can become defensive when they're ashamed or frightened. But if someone repeatedly refuses to address their behavior, continually redirects blame onto you, and never makes meaningful changes, that's a pattern worth taking seriously. You don't need to accept false responsibility simply because someone is angry with you. A useful question is, are we actually addressing what happened, or am I being pulled into defending myself? If the conversation keeps becoming a trial of your character, you can step back. You don't have to defend every accusation. You can return to the original issue, state your boundary, and refuse to participate in a conversation designed to make you responsible for someone else's choices. Accountability means each person owns their behavior, not one person carrying the entire burden while the other keeps pointing fingers. When someone knows they have been caught, you might expect the evidence to make the conversation easier. You have the messages, you remember what was said, you know what you witnessed. So you assume that eventually the person will acknowledge what happened, but sometimes the opposite occurs. The more clearly the evidence threatens their version of themselves, the harder they may push you to doubt your own perception. This is where gaslighting can become especially powerful. You might hear, "You're imagining things," "You're too sensitive," "That's not what happened," or "You always twist everything." Instead of addressing the evidence, the conversation becomes an attack on your ability to interpret reality. And that's what makes this pattern so destabilizing. You may walk into the conversation feeling certain about what happened and walk away wondering, maybe I really am overreacting. That self-doubt is important to recognize. Gaslighting is not simply someone remembering an event differently. Human memory is imperfect, and two people can genuinely have different perspectives. The concerning pattern is when someone repeatedly dismisses your perception, denies clear events, changes the story, and pressures you to abandon your understanding of what happened. And again, this does not mean every person who disagrees with you is narcissistic. The key is the repeated pattern and the impact it has on the relationship. When you encounter this, you don't necessarily need to become a detective trying to prove every detail. You can anchor yourself in what you know. You can say, we remember this differently, but I know what I experienced. You can write things down if that helps you maintain clarity. You can talk to someone you trust who can provide an outside perspective. And most importantly, you can pay attention to behavior rather than getting trapped in an endless argument over reality. Because sometimes the most important question isn't, can I convince this person that I am right? It's, what happens to me when I repeatedly have conversations like this? Do you feel confused, anxious, constantly defensive, afraid to trust your own memory? Those effects matter. You don't need another person's permission to trust your own experience. And when someone repeatedly requires you to abandon your reality so they can avoid accountability, the problem is no longer just the original incident. The pattern itself has become the problem. When someone is confronted with behavior they know is wrong, one of the most effective ways to avoid accountability is to attack the person bringing the information. Instead of answering the question, they make you the problem. Suddenly, you're not discussing what they did. You're discussing your personality, your intentions, your emotional state, or your supposed flaws. You might say, I felt hurt when you spoke to me that way, and here, you're so sensitive. You might say, I saw what happened, and here, you're obsessed with me. You might ask for an explanation, and suddenly you're being called controlling, jealous, dramatic, unstable, or impossible to please. Notice how quickly the subject changes. This can be particularly powerful because most emotionally healthy people don't enjoy being attacked. When someone questions your character, your instinct may be to defend yourself. You start explaining, you start providing context, you start proving that you're not jealous, not crazy, not controlling, not dramatic. And while you're defending yourself, the original behavior is no longer being discussed. That is the trap. The goal may not even be conscious. A person can become defensive without deliberately planning to manipulate you. But regardless of intention, the effect can be the same. Accountability disappears. This is why you need to be careful about getting pulled into every accusation. You don't have to prove that you're a perfect person before you're allowed to address someone's harmful behavior. You can have flaws and still be telling the truth. You can have made mistakes and still have a valid boundary. You can be emotional and still have a legitimate concern. Being upset does not automatically make you wrong. And this is where emotional grounding becomes so important. Instead of asking, how do I convince them that I'm a good person? Ask, are they answering the issue I raised? If the answer is repeatedly no, pay attention. Because a healthy conversation can include disagreement, frustration, and even strong emotions while still returning to the actual problem. But when every confrontation becomes an attack on your character, you're no longer having a conversation about accountability. You're being distracted from the behavior. And sometimes the strongest response isn't a longer explanation. It's simply, we're not going to change the subject. I'm talking about what happened. Then watch what happens next. Their response may tell you everything you need to know. When someone knows they have been caught, one of the things they may do is change the story. Not necessarily in one dramatic moment, but little by little. The details shift, the sequence changes, their intentions suddenly become different. And before you realize what happened, you are no longer discussing their behavior. You are debating which version of the past is actually real. You might remember a conversation clearly. You remember what was said, what happened afterward, and how you felt, but when you bring it up, they respond, that's not what happened. Then they give you another version. You explain what you remember, and another detail changes. This can leave you incredibly confused. You may begin thinking, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I remembered it incorrectly. Maybe I'm being unfair. And it's important to acknowledge that human memory is imperfect. Two people can genuinely remember the same event differently. A disagreement about the past does not automatically mean someone is manipulating you. The concern is the pattern. If someone's version of events consistently changes whenever accountability appears, that's something worth noticing. Especially when every revised version somehow removes their responsibility and places you in the role of the problem. Maybe they say, I never promised that. Then later, I said I would try. Then eventually, you knew I wasn't serious. The details keep moving, but the destination stays the same. They never have to be responsible. This is why you don't want to spend your entire life trying to reconstruct every conversation just to prove that your experience was legitimate. You can write things down when something important happens. You can keep relevant messages. You can talk to someone you trust. And you can pay attention to the broader pattern instead of becoming obsessed with winning one argument. Ask yourself, does this person ever say, I may remember it differently, but I understand why you were hurt? Or do they always need the story to end with them completely innocent? Because accountability does not require perfect memory. It requires humility. It requires the ability to say, maybe I got this wrong. And if someone repeatedly rewrites history whenever they are confronted, you don't have to become the prosecutor, detective, and historian of the relationship. You can simply recognize the pattern, and sometimes recognizing the pattern is more important than proving the past. When someone knows they have hurt you, you might expect an apology to bring relief. You expect them to recognize what they did, understand the impact, and make an effort to change. But sometimes an apology can sound like accountability while actually avoiding it. You might hear, I'm sorry, but you pushed me too far, or I'm sorry you felt that way, or even, fine, I'm sorry, are you happy now? Notice what happens in these statements. The word sorry is present, but responsibility may be missing. A genuine apology doesn't require you to accept blame for the other person's behavior. It doesn't turn immediately into an explanation about why they had no choice. And it doesn't demand that you stop being hurt simply because they said the word sorry. This is where people can become trapped. They hear the apology and think, okay, maybe everything is going to change now. But then the same behavior happens again. Another betrayal, another lie, another boundary crossed, another apology. And eventually, the apology itself becomes part of the cycle. This doesn't mean every imperfect apology is manipulative. People are often awkward when they apologize. They may become defensive because they're ashamed. They may need time to understand the impact of what they did. The bigger question is what happens afterward. Do they change their behavior? Do they make repairs? Do they become more respectful of your boundaries? Do they try to understand the impact they had on you? Or do they apologize simply to end the conversation and return to the same behavior? Because accountability is not measured by how emotional the apology sounds. It's measured by what happens next. Someone can cry, become deeply emotional, tell you how much they love you, promise that it will never happen again, and still repeat the exact same behavior. That's why you have to look beyond the words. A meaningful apology has a direction. It moves toward repair. It says, in effect, I see what I did, I understand that it affected you, and I am willing to do something differently. And if the behavior never changes, you are allowed to stop treating apologies as proof of transformation. You can appreciate the words while still watching the pattern. Because forgiveness without accountability can simply create permission for the cycle to continue. You don't have to punish someone. You don't have to hate them. You simply have to believe behavior when behavior keeps telling you the same story. When you're dealing with someone who repeatedly avoids accountability, it can become almost impossible to resist the urge to make them admit what they did. You want them to say, yes, I lied. You want them to acknowledge the betrayal. You want them to finally understand how much they hurt you. And sometimes you believe that if you can just explain it one more time, show them one more piece of evidence, or ask the question in exactly the right way, they'll finally take responsibility. But what if they never do? This is one of the hardest realities to accept. You cannot force another person to develop accountability. You can present the facts. You can explain the impact. You can communicate your feelings. You can set a boundary. But you cannot make someone become honest simply because you need honesty from them. And when you spend too much energy trying to extract a confession, you can become trapped in an endless cycle. You explain. They deny. You provide evidence. They change the subject. You clarify. They attack. You defend yourself. And then you're back at the beginning. Meanwhile, your emotional energy is being consumed by someone else's refusal to take responsibility. This is why it can be more powerful to shift the question. Instead of asking, how do I make them admit they're wrong? Ask, what am I going to do with what I've already seen? Because you don't necessarily need a confession to recognize a pattern. If someone repeatedly lies, repeatedly breaks agreements, repeatedly violates your boundaries, and repeatedly refuses to repair the damage, that pattern is information. Their refusal to acknowledge it doesn't erase what happened. And this doesn't mean you should automatically label someone a narcissist or assume every conflict is abuse. Context matters. People make mistakes. People can learn. People can change. But change requires something very basic: willingness. Willingness to listen, willingness to reflect, willingness to acknowledge harm, willingness to do something differently. If that willingness is consistently absent, you have to stop making your healing dependent on their realization. Your closure may not come from hearing, you were right. It may come from recognizing, I know what I experience, I know what pattern I have been living with, and I know what I am willing to accept from this point forward. That is a powerful shift. You stop chasing their confession. You stop debating your reality. You stop trying to win a courtroom case inside a relationship, and you start making decisions based on behavior. Because ultimately, you don't need someone to confess that they hurt you before you're allowed to protect yourself. You don't need their agreement to have a boundary, and you don't need their apology to decide that a pattern is no longer acceptable. Sometimes the most important form of accountability is not the accountability you get from them. It's the accountability you give yourself to believe what you see, honor what you feel, and protect the life you are trying to build. And maybe that's the part I want you to remember most. When someone knows they have done something wrong, you may never get the confession you deserve. You may never hear, I hurt you. You may never get the explanation that finally makes everything make sense. And you may never receive the apology you were hoping for. But your healing cannot depend on someone else's willingness to tell the truth. Look at the pattern. Look at the behavior. Look at what happens when you set a boundary. Look at what happens when you stop accepting excuses. Because accountability isn't what someone says when they're cornered. Accountability is what they do when nobody is forcing them to change. And if someone repeatedly denies, blames, attacks, rewrites the story, and apologizes only to repeat the same behavior, you don't have to keep standing in front of the same door waiting for it to open. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to trust your experience. You are allowed to stop explaining yourself. And most importantly, you are allowed to choose peace over proving your point. So don't make your healing dependent on getting them to admit what they did. Sometimes closure isn't hearing them say, you were right. Sometimes closure is finally being able to say to yourself, I know what I experienced. I know what I will no longer accept, and I don't need their permission to move forward. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and remember, you don't have to win the argument to protect your reality. You just have to stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable.